Imagine standing on a battlefield where everything humanity believed about war was about to shatter. For over a century, one military formation had dominated every conflict it entered. The Macedonian phalanx, that magnificent wall of bronze shields and 18-foot spears, had carved out empires and crushed armies from Greece to India. It was the weapon that put Alexander the Great's name in the history books forever. To face a phalanx in battle was to face certain death. Commanders across the ancient world copied it, studied it, feared it. It seemed unstoppable, a perfect killing machine, refined over generations. But perfection, as history loves to remind us, is always temporary. On a misty morning in 197 BC, on hills that the Greeks called Cynocephali, the dog's heads, this legendary formation would meet its match. Not another phalanx, but something entirely different. An army that didn't fight like a solid wall, but like flowing water, finding every crack, exploiting every weakness. This wasn't just another battle between rival kingdoms fighting over territory. This was a collision between two completely opposite philosophies of warfare, two different visions of how human beings should organize violence. And the outcome wouldn't just decide who controlled Greece. It would determine the future of military tactics for the next 2,000 years. Here's what makes this story even more remarkable. The decisive moment, the action that turned certain defeat into total victory, wasn't ordered by a general or planned by strategists. It was the split-second decision of one mid-level officer whose name we don't even know. One man who saw an opportunity and had the courage to break formation, to abandon the plan, to trust his instincts. That decision changed everything. Watch until the end to discover how this anonymous warrior proved that in war, rigid discipline can be a weakness, and that sometimes chaos is the highest form of order. But first, let me ask you this. Which matters more in battle, overwhelming power, or the ability to adapt? Think about it and drop your answer in the comments. And if you want to explore more battles that changed history, subscribe now, because we're just getting started. To understand what happened on those hills, we need to understand what made these two military systems so fundamentally different. Let's start with the phalanx, because its story begins with one of history's most brilliant military innovations. Picture this. It's the 4th century BC, and warfare in Greece is chaotic. Armies are loose collections of individual warriors, each man fighting for personal glory. Battles are disorganized, unpredictable, often decided by which side panics first. Then comes Philip II of Macedon, Alexander's father, and he revolutionizes everything. Philip's insight was simple but devastating. What if soldiers stopped thinking of themselves as individuals and became parts of a single organism? What if instead of thousands of separate fighters, you created one unified killing machine? The phalanx was born from this vision. 16 rows of men, standing shoulder to shoulder in perfect formation. Each warrior carried a sarissa, a pike so long it took 2 hands to hold. The first 5 rows would lower their pikes forward, creating an impenetrable hedge of iron points. Behind them, the remaining rows would angle their weapons upward, protecting the formation from arrows and javelins raining down from above. When a phalanx advanced, it was like watching a forest of spears move forward as one entity. The psychological impact was tremendous. Imagine being a soldier in an opposing army, watching this thing march toward you, this geometric perfection bristling with death, moving with the inevitability of a glacier. You couldn't flank it because it was too wide. You couldn't break through it because the layers were too deep. If you tried to charge it, you'd be impaled before you got within sword range. On flat, open ground, the phalanx was essentially unbeatable. Alexander proved this by conquering most of the known world. But here's the critical weakness that few people recognized at the time. The phalanx only worked as long as it stayed together. Those 18-foot pikes were incredible weapons when you had room to use them, but they required space, coordination, and level ground. If the formation broke, if gaps appeared, if the terrain got rough, suddenly those long spears became liabilities. A phalanx soldier couldn't turn quickly, couldn't fight as an individual, couldn't adapt to unexpected situations. He was powerful as part of the machine, but helpless alone. The phalanx represented a philosophy that valued unity, discipline, and overwhelming force applied in one direction. It was the hammer, looking for a nail. Now let's talk about what the Romans built, because it came from an entirely different way of thinking. The Roman legion wasn't designed to be one giant formation. Instead, it was made up of 30 smaller units called maniples, each containing about 120 men. These maniples were arranged in a checkerboard pattern, 3 lines deep. The front line consisted of younger soldiers, the hastati. Behind them stood the more experienced principes, and in reserve you had the grizzled veterans, the triarii, whose presence gave rise to the Roman saying, "It has come to the triarii," meaning the situation had become desperate. Each maniple could operate independently. If one unit got into trouble, the one behind it could advance through the gaps to help. If soldiers got tired, they could rotate back and fresh troops could take their place. The formation could expand, contract, refuse a flank, or split to let skirmishers retreat through it. It was modular, adaptable, alive. The legion was designed for the messy reality of warfare, where things never go according to plan, where terrain is uneven, where circumstances change moment by moment. The weapons reflected this philosophy too. Where the phalanx soldier had his long pike and little else, the Roman legionary carried a toolkit for different situations. He had 2 pila, heavy javelins designed to pierce shields and armor at medium range. Once he'd thrown those, he drew his gladius, a short sword perfect for close quarters combat. The gladius was brutal in tight spaces where long weapons became useless. A legionary was trained to fight both in formation and as an individual warrior. He was a cog in the machine, yes, but a cog that could think. This difference in equipment revealed a deeper philosophical divide. The Macedonian system assumed battles would be decided by the collision of formations, by the disciplined application of mass and momentum. The Roman system assumed battles would be chaotic, close range, decided by soldiers making quick decisions in the confusion of combat. One system trusted the plan, the other system trusted the soldiers. One was a rigid hierarchy, the other was controlled chaos. Both had proven effective in their respective theaters of war, but they'd never directly confronted each other at full strength. The question everyone was asking by the late 3rd century BC was this: what happens when the hammer meets the water, when overwhelming force confronts infinite adaptability? The hills of Cynocephaly were about to provide the answer, and it would shock the ancient world. But why were these 2 powers even fighting? What brought Rome and Macedon into conflict in the first place? The answer lies in the complex geopolitics of the Mediterranean world after the Second Punic War. Rome had just finished a brutal 15-year struggle against Hannibal and Carthage. It was exhausted but victorious, and most importantly, it was now the undisputed power in the Western Mediterranean. The Senate in Rome looked around and realized something crucial. There were no more threats close to home, which meant it was time to look east. The Eastern Mediterranean was a different world, rich with Greek culture, ancient cities, and vast wealth. But politically it was fragmenting. After Alexander the Great died in 323 BC without a clear heir, his empire had split among his generals. By 200 BC, their successors ruled various Hellenistic kingdoms, constantly fighting each other for advantage. Macedonia, under King Philip V, was the most powerful of these successor states, but it was surrounded by rivals and smaller Greek city-states that feared an ambitious ruler who dreamed of restoring his kingdom to the glory days of Alexander. He'd been expanding his influence in Greece, making alliances, pressuring cities, gradually building a sphere of control. This made the other Greek states nervous, and some of them did what weaker powers have always done when threatened by a strong neighbor. They called in an outside power for protection. They sent embassies to Rome, asking for help against Macedonian aggression, offering friendship and trade in exchange for Roman intervention. The Roman Senate saw a golden opportunity. They could present themselves as liberators of the Greeks while actually establishing their own dominance in the region. It was a perfect excuse for expansion dressed up in noble rhetoric. The Senate sent Philip an ultimatum: stop expanding, withdraw from the Greek cities, respect their independence. Philip, confident in his army and his right to dominate his own sphere of influence, essentially told Rome to mind mind its own business. It was the response of a proud king who didn't yet understand that the world had changed, that Rome wasn't just another regional power, but an emerging superpower with unprecedented military capacity. War was declared in 200 BC, beginning what historians call the Second Macedonian War. The first couple of years were inconclusive. Rome sent armies to Greece, but they were commanded by average generals who couldn't figure out how to defeat the Macedonian phalanx in open battle. Philip held his ground, winning some engagements, losing others, but keeping his kingdom intact. The war was becoming a stalemate, which was actually favorable to Philip, since Rome was fighting far from home and the costs were mounting. Then, in 198 BC, the Roman Senate made a crucial decision. They assigned command of the Greek campaign to a young unconventional consul named Titus Quinctius Flamininus. This choice was brilliant and revealed Rome's strategic sophistication. Flamininus was only 30 years old, unusually young for such an important command. But he had something most Roman generals lacked. He was a Philhellene, a lover of Greek culture. He spoke fluent Greek, had studied Greek philosophy and literature, and genuinely admired the civilization he was being sent to conquer. This made him the perfect weapon for Rome's strategy. Flamininus could fight Philip on the battlefield, but more importantly, he could fight him in the arena of propaganda and diplomacy. He traveled through Greece giving speeches, promising that Rome had no interest in conquering Greek cities, that they were coming only to free Greece from Macedonian tyranny. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, a fellow admirer of Greek culture who wanted to see the great cities independent once more. Many Greeks, tired of Macedonian pressure, wanted to believe him. Philip's alliance system began to fracture as cities switched sides or declared neutrality. On the other side stood Philip V, a man in his early 40s, a veteran of decades of warfare and political intrigue. Philip was everything a Macedonian king was supposed to be: brave, personally leading his troops in battle, skilled in tactics, ruthless when necessary. He'd spent his entire life learning to command the phalanx, understanding its strengths and limitations. He believed in the military system that had made his ancestors great. For Philip, this war wasn't just about territory. It was about proving that Macedon still mattered, that the legacy of Alexander still had power, that these upstart Romans from the west couldn't simply march in and dictate terms to the heirs of the greatest conqueror in history. So we have two men, both intelligent, both capable, both absolutely convinced of the superiority of their approach. Flamininus believed in the flexibility of the legion, in the Roman system of maneuver and adaptation. Philip believed in the crushing power of the phalanx, in the discipline and unity that had conquered the East. Their armies mirrored their personalities. Flamininus commanded a diverse force of Roman legions, Italian allies, Greek auxiliaries, and cavalry from various sources. It was cosmopolitan, flexible, held together by Roman organizational genius. Philip commanded an army built around his professional Macedonian corps, the phalangites, who trained year-round in the use of their long pikes. Supported by auxiliary troops from his subject territories, both commanders knew that a decisive battle was coming. The war couldn't drag on forever. Rome's patience had limits, and Philip's resources were being drained by the constant campaigning. They maneuvered through the Greek countryside, each trying to find the perfect ground for battle. Philip wanted a wide, flat plain where his phalanx could deploy in its full glory and simply roll over the opposition. Flamininus wanted rough, broken terrain where the phalanx couldn't maintain formation, and his maniples could exploit gaps and weak points. It was a strategic chess match, each commander declining battle when the conditions didn't suit him, trying to force the enemy to fight on unfavorable ground. This dance continued through the spring of 197 BC as both armies moved through Thessaly, the broad region in central Greece. Neither could find the perfect battlefield. And then, as so often happens in war, accident and circumstance took over. The battle that would decide everything didn't happen on ground chosen by either commander. It happened by chance, in the worst possible location for a set-piece engagement on a morning when neither side could even see the enemy clearly. The stage was set not by human planning, but by fog, confusion, and the random encounter of advanced patrols. Sometimes history's most important moments begin with nobody in control. An ugly name for an unremarkable series of hills. The term meant dogs' heads in Greek, presumably because someone thought the ridgeline looked like the profile of canine skulls. It wasn't the kind of terrain any sane commander would choose for a major battle. The hills were steep, rocky, covered with scrub vegetation, cut through with small ravines. Deploying a proper battle line here would be nearly impossible. Both Philip and Flamininus knew this, which is why neither planned to fight here. But war has a way of forcing commanders' hands. The weather that morning was terrible. A thick fog had settled over the hills, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Both armies were camped on opposite sides of the ridge, neither fully aware of exactly where the other was. The fog made reconnaissance nearly impossible. In these conditions, both commanders made the same sensible decision: send cavalry and light infantry to the ridge to scout the enemy position and secure the high ground. It was a standard precaution. Neither expected it to trigger anything major, but on the summit of those fog-shrouded hills, the Roman and Macedonian scouting forces ran directly into each other. Suddenly, men were fighting in limited visibility, small units clashing in the mist, neither side sure of how many enemies they faced. Both sides sent reinforcements. What started as a skirmish between a few hundred cavalry escalated rapidly. More troops poured in from both camps. The battle for the hilltops intensified, and still the fog obscured everything. Down in their respective camps, Philip and Flamininus received confused, contradictory reports. Their scouts were engaged. The fighting was intensifying. But how many enemy troops were involved? Was this just a raid, or was it the main enemy army? The fog made it impossible to know. Both commanders faced the same agonizing decision. Do you commit your main force to a battle you can't see, on terrain you don't want, in conditions that make command and control nearly impossible? Or do you withdraw and risk losing the initiative, letting the enemy secure the high ground? Philip made his decision first. He would commit. The Macedonian king decided to lead half of his phalanx up the hills to support his troops who were struggling on the summit. It was a gamble. The terrain was awful for the phalanx, and he was only committing half his force because the other half wasn't even formed up yet. But Philip was an aggressive commander, and he believed that seizing the high ground would give him the advantage. He personally led his right wing up the slope, leaving orders for his left wing to form up and follow as quickly as possible. Flamininus saw his own troops being pushed back and made a similar commitment. He sent cavalry and more infantry to reinforce the fight. The battle was escalating beyond anyone's control, driven by the logic of combat itself. Neither commander could see the full picture, but both were now invested. The accidental skirmish was becoming a full-scale engagement, and there was no pulling back. The Battle of Cynocephalae had begun, not through strategic planning, but through the chaotic collision of scouts in the fog. And as the morning progressed and the fog began to lift, both armies found themselves committed to a battle that would be decided not by the perfect execution of tactical plans, but by whoever could adapt fastest to the messy, broken, confused reality on the ground. The phalanx was about to be tested in the worst possible conditions. The legion was about to prove why it had been designed for exactly this kind of chaos. As the fog began to thin, the true scope of the battle became visible, and what emerged was essentially two separate fights happening simultaneously on different parts of the ridge. On the Macedonian right wing, Philip's gamble was paying off brilliantly. His phalanx had managed to reach the crest of the hills and was now advancing downhill against the Roman left wing. Even on this imperfect terrain, the phalanx demonstrated why it had dominated warfare for over a century. Picture the scene from a Roman legionary's perspective. You're standing on a hillside, and above you, emerging from the thinning mist, comes a geometric nightmare. Thousands of men in perfect alignment, their long pikes lowered, moving down the slope with gathering momentum. The front ranks present an impenetrable wall of iron points. You have a sword that's barely 2 feet long, and the nearest enemy blade is 15 feet away behind a forest of pike shafts. How do you even engage? How do you fight something you can't reach? The answer is you can't. The Roman left wing tried to hold, but it was being overwhelmed by simple physics and geometry. The phalanx, even on rough ground, was managing to maintain enough cohesion to be devastating. Philip had positioned himself at the front, visible to his men, encouraging them, directing the advance. He could see the Romans falling back, their formations breaking under the pressure of the long sarissas. Victory seemed within reach. If he could shatter the Roman left, he could roll up their entire line, trap them against the hills, and turn this into a decisive massacre that would end the war. The Roman maniples on this flank fought with desperate courage. But courage wasn't enough against the mechanical advantage of the phalanx. The centurions tried to find weak points, to dart in between the pikes, to hack at the wooden shafts with their swords. Some succeeded, cutting through pike shafts, creating brief openings. But for every gap made, the ranks behind stepped forward to fill it. The phalanx was designed for exactly this, to absorb damage, maintain formation, and grind forward relentlessly. Flamininus, watching his left wing crumble, threw in his reserves. It made no difference. The phalanx was doing what it had been built to do, and on this part of the battlefield, the Romans had no answer for it. If the entire battle had looked like this, we'd remember Cynocephalae as Philip's greatest triumph, as the day the phalanx proved it was still the master of the battlefield. History would have been completely different. Macedonia might have forced Rome to accept a negotiated peace, maintaining its independence and influence. The Hellenistic East might have remained free of Roman domination for generations longer. But here's the thing about warfare: battles are rarely uniform. What's happening on one part of the field doesn't determine what's happening everywhere else. And while Philip's right wing was crushing the opposition, his left wing was walking into a catastrophe. Remember, Philip had committed only half his phalanx to the initial assault. The other half, his left wing, had been ordered to form up an advance, but they were behind schedule. As they finally crested the ridge and began to descend the opposite slope, they found themselves in a nightmare scenario for phalanx warfare. The terrain here was even worse, steeper, more broken, scattered with rocks and bushes. The phalanx formation began to fragment as men struggled over obstacles, moved around impassable sections, and tried to keep their long pikes from getting tangled in vegetation. Instead of one solid line, the Macedonian left wing became a disorganized mass of small groups, gaps appearing in their formation. And waiting for them, perfectly positioned, was Flamininus with the Roman right wing. This is where the legion showed its true genius. The maniples didn't need perfect terrain or straight lines. Each 120-man unit could navigate independently, flowing around obstacles, maintaining cohesion even on broken ground. As the disordered Macedonian left struggled down the hill, the Roman maniples hit them like a pack of wolves attacking a wounded animal. The legionaries targeted the gaps in the phalanx, the spaces where isolated groups of phalangites couldn't support each other. In these small, chaotic melees, the gladius proved superior to the sarissa. Once you got past the pike point, the Macedonian soldier was nearly helpless. His weapon was too long to use in close combat. He carried minimal armor to stay mobile in formation. He'd been trained to fight as part of a wall, not as an individual. The legionaries, by contrast, were trained for exactly this kind of close-quarters chaos. They punched with their shields, stabbed with short, brutal efficiency, worked in pairs and small groups. The Macedonian left wing was being torn apart. Flamininus recognized the opportunity. He didn't need to just defeat this wing. He needed to destroy it quickly and then use his victorious troops somewhere else, because he could see that his own left wing was in desperate trouble. He pressed the attack ruthlessly, and the Macedonian left began to collapse entirely. Some units tried to surrender, others broke and ran. Within minutes, the situation on this side of the battlefield was the complete opposite of Philip's wing. The Romans had won decisively, so now we have a battle split in two. Philip is winning on one flank, Flamininus on the other. Both commanders have achieved success on their respective wings. The battle is balanced on a knife edge. What happens next will depend entirely on who can exploit their advantage fastest. This is the moment that would define not just this battle, but the future of military tactics. And it would be decided not by either commander, but by a nameless officer who was about to make the most important tactical decision military tribune on Flamininus's victorious right wing. We don't know his name. Ancient sources don't record it. He's probably in his 20s or 30s, a member of the Roman aristocratic class doing his military service, commanding a couple of maniples. He's just helped crush the Macedonian left wing, and now he looks across the battlefield and sees something that makes his blood run cold. On the opposite hillside, the Roman left wing is being destroyed. His fellow citizens, his friends perhaps, are being pushed back, cut down, overwhelmed by Philip's unstoppable phalanx. If nothing changes, that wing will collapse completely. Once that happens, Philip can pivot his victorious troops and attack the center and right from behind. The entire Roman army could be encircled and annihilated. This nameless tribune understands that having won his part of the battle means nothing if the army loses overall. Here's where it gets interesting. The standard procedure, what his training told him to do, was to hold position and wait for orders from Flamininus. Roman military discipline was famous for its strictness. You didn't abandon your position. You didn't break formation without orders. The legion worked because everyone followed the plan. But this officer looks at the situation and realizes that by the time he finds Flamininus, explains the situation, gets orders, and moves his troops, it will be too late. The left wing will have collapsed. Sometimes discipline means following orders. Sometimes it means understanding the commander's intent and acting on your own initiative to fulfill it. So this tribune makes a decision that will echo through military history. He takes command of 20 maniples, roughly 2,400 men, about a third of the Roman right wing. Without orders, without permission, he wheels them away from the defeated enemy in front of them and marches rapidly across the rear of the Roman battle line. His target is not the front of Philip's phalanx, where Roman soldiers are dying by the dozen. His target is its back. Think about the audacity of this decision. He's taking a large portion of the army away from its assigned position. If he's wrong, if this fails, he'll be court-martialed at best. Roman military law was brutal about unauthorized actions that endangered the army. But he's betting everything on his reading of the tactical situation. And he's betting on one crucial weakness of the phalanx that every theorist knew, but few had been able to exploit in actual battle. It can only fight in one direction. The phalanx is designed to present an invincible front. All its armor, all its weapons, all its tactical training focuses on forward combat. The phalangites are packed so tightly together that they literally cannot turn around individually. Rotating the entire formation is a slow, complex maneuver that requires clear commands, organization, and space. Under pressure, in the middle of combat, it's nearly impossible. And even if you could somehow turn the rear ranks to face a new threat, they're not equipped for it. The men in the back rows are virtually unarmored. They're holding long pikes that are useful for adding depth to the forward attack, but useless for defending against enemies at close range behind them. The tribune's maniples crash into the rear of Philip's victorious phalanx. Like a hammer hitting glass, the Macedonians in the back ranks don't even see them coming. They're focused forward, pushing against the Romans in front, celebrating their imminent victory. Suddenly there are legionaries among them, gladi rising and falling, cutting down men who can't defend themselves. Panic spreads instantly. The phalangites try to turn to face this new threat, but they can't. They're locked in formation, packed together, their long weapons tangling with their comrades. The men in front are still fighting the Roman left wing, completely unaware of the disaster unfolding behind them. The officers are screaming contradictory orders. Some units try to turn, breaking formation. Others try to hold positions. The result is chaos. The Roman left wing, which moments ago was on the verge of collapse, sees what's happening. The pressure from the phalanx suddenly lessens as the Macedonians are thrown into confusion. The centurions immediately recognize the opportunity and rally their men. Instead of being the hammer crushing the Romans, Philip's phalanx is now trapped between two forces, being hit from front and rear simultaneously. It's a total collapse. The formation that held together through the advance, that maintained discipline under attack from the front, simply disintegrates when attacked from a direction it cannot face. Phalangites drop their unwieldy sarissas and try to draw swords or simply run. But they're packed so tightly that running is almost impossible. The men in the middle ranks are crushed in the press, killed by Romans from behind and their own fleeing comrades from the front. Philip, at the front of his phalanx, realizes something has gone terribly wrong when the formation stops advancing and the sounds behind him change from ordered shouting to screams of panic. He tries to turn his horse to see what's happening, and the sight must have been devastating. His perfect formation, his invincible phalanx, is coming apart. Men are throwing down their weapons, trying to surrender or flee. The Romans are cutting through the rear ranks like they're harvesting wheat. The king faces an impossible choice. He can stay and die with his men in a heroic last stand, or he can survive to rebuild his kingdom and perhaps fight another day. Philip chooses survival. With a small group of bodyguards, he fights his way out of the collapsing formation and flees the battlefield. It's the practical choice, the strategic choice, but it means abandoning his army to its fate. Without the king's presence, without leadership, the Macedonian resistance collapses entirely. The battle becomes a massacre. The Macedonian soldiers try to signal surrender by raising their pikes vertically, the traditional gesture. But the Romans either don't understand the signal or choose not to. The legionaries are in the fury of battle, their blood up, seeing enemies who just minutes ago were killing their friends. They push forward through the disordered mass of Macedonians, and the gladius does its terrible work at close range, where it's most effective. Thousands of Macedonians die in the rout. Thousands more are captured. The rest scatter across the countryside. The Battle of Cynoscephalae is over. It lasted only a few hours, beginning in accidental fog and ending in decisive slaughter. And it was decided by one nameless officer who had the tactical insight to see what needed to be done and the courage to do it without orders. That's the moment that changed warfare. Not a new weapon, not superior numbers, but the application of flexibility and initiative against rigidity and centralized command. The phalanx had met its nemesis, and the legion stood triumphant. The immediate aftermath of Cynoscephalae was brutal for Macedon. Philip had lost approximately 8,000 dead and 5,000 captured from an army of perhaps 25,000. The losses included much of his professional phalanx corps, men who had trained for years and couldn't easily be replaced. The Roman casualties were relatively light, maybe 700 dead, most of those from the left wing before the tribune's decisive maneuver. It wasn't even close. Philip sued for peace immediately. He had no choice. His army was shattered, his treasury depleted, and his allies were abandoning him. The Romans dictated harsh terms. Macedon had to evacuate all Greek cities, surrender its entire navy except for a token force, pay a massive indemnity of 1,000 talents, and give hostages, including Philip's own son, to guarantee compliance. In effect, Macedon ceased to be a great power. It remained independent in name, but became a Roman client state, its foreign policy controlled by the Senate. But the real significance of Cynoscephalae went far beyond the immediate political settlement. This battle sent a message across the entire Hellenistic world. The phalanx was obsolete. Every kingdom in the eastern Mediterranean used variations of the Macedonian system. They'd all believed it was the ultimate military formation. In one afternoon, that belief was shattered. The flexible Roman legion had proven superior in every way that mattered. The following year, at the Isthmian Games in Corinth, Flamininus made his famous proclamation. In front of massive crowds, He announced that Rome was granting freedom to all the Greek cities previously under Macedonian control. The Greeks erupted in celebration, hailing Flamininus as a liberator, even a savior. Of course, freedom in Roman terms meant something different than genuine independence. The Greek cities were free from Macedon, but dependent on Rome for protection, which gave Rome effective control without the expense of direct occupation. It was a masterful propaganda move that disguised imperialism as liberation. Flamininus returned to Rome a hero. He was granted a triumph, the highest honor Rome could bestow. He was only 33 years old, and he'd effectively conquered Greece and neutralized Macedon as a threat. His career demonstrated that Rome's system worked not just militarily, but politically and diplomatically. The Republic was learning to project power across the Mediterranean, not just through legions, but through a sophisticated combination of military force. Propaganda, alliance building, and cynocephaly were studied and absorbed. The battle proved that flexibility was more valuable than brute force, that an army of independent units could outmaneuver a monolithic formation, that adaptability mattered more than tradition. These weren't abstract principles. Commanders across the Mediterranean saw the practical proof. The legendary phalanx, the formation of Alexander the Great, had been decisively beaten. Subsequent Hellenistic kingdoms tried to reform their armies, incorporating some Roman principles, but they never fully abandoned the phalanx. Cultural pride and tradition made it impossible. They'd been using this system for generations. It was central to their military identity. So they made modifications, added more flexibility, tried to protect the flanks better, but the fundamental structure remained. And every time they faced Rome in battle, they lost. The Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC, where Rome defeated the Seleucid Empire, followed a similar pattern. Roman flexibility exploited phalanx rigidity. Pydna in 168 BC was another crushing Roman victory over Macedon, using the same basic approach. The legion would dominate Mediterranean warfare for the next 500 years. Its design philosophy, the concept of an army as a collection of independent units working toward a common goal rather than a single rigid formation, became the foundation of Western military tactics. Even today, modern armies are organized around the same basic principle: flexibility, initiative at lower levels, ability to adapt to changing circumstances. We call them different things now, battalions and companies instead of maniples, but the concept is the same. There's a deeper lesson in cynocephaly that transcends military history. It's about the danger of assuming that any system, no matter how successful, will remain dominant forever. The phalanx had worked brilliantly for Alexander. It had conquered from Greece to India, defeating every army it encountered. That success created a kind of mental lock among Hellenistic commanders. They couldn't imagine that something better might exist. They kept refining and perfecting the phalanx, making it more specialized, more dependent on specific conditions. And in doing so, they made it brittle. The Romans, by contrast, built a system that assumed uncertainty and chaos. They didn't try to create the perfect formation for ideal conditions. They created a flexible toolkit that could handle imperfect conditions, unexpected situations, broken terrain, and bad luck. When the two philosophies collided, flexibility crushed perfection, because perfection only works when conditions are perfect. And in war they never are, and then there's that nameless tribune, the man whose decision won the battle, but whose identity is lost to history. He represents something important about how success actually happens. The great commanders get remembered, Flamininus and Philip, but often the decisive moments come from someone acting outside the formal hierarchy. Someone close enough to the action to see what needs to be done, and empowered enough to do it. The Roman system worked partly because it created room for that initiative. A Macedonian phalanx soldier couldn't have done what that tribune did. He would have lacked the authority, the training, the permission. The rigid system prevented exactly that kind of individual action. So when we ask what really defeated the phalanx at Cynocephalae, the answer isn't just better tactics or superior weapons. It was a cultural difference in how the two societies thought about organization, authority, and adaptation. Rome built a military culture that valued initiative within a framework of discipline. Macedon built a culture that valued perfect execution of a predetermined plan. Both can work, but when they clash, the adaptive system has an advantage because it can absorb failure, adjust, and find new approaches. The rigid system must succeed on its own terms or not at all. The hills of Cynocephalae witnessed the end of an era and the beginning of another. The age when warfare was about massing the most powerful formation in the perfect position was over. The age of flexible, responsive, adaptive military systems had begun. And that change rippled forward through history, influencing how armies would fight for millennia to come. All because of one foggy morning, one accidental battle, and one officer who dared to break formation when it mattered most. What other decisive battles would you like us to explore? What moments in history do you think changed the world forever? Drop your suggestions in the comments, and if you want to keep exploring the battles that shaped civilization, make sure you're subscribed. History is full of moments when everything changed in an instant, and we're going to find them all. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.